Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can hear me. If somebody doesn't hear me, then please raise your hand or do some shouting. My name is Magnus Tumi Guðmundsson. I'm the head of the Faculty of Earth Sciences at the University of Iceland. And today, on the 27th of May, 2020, we have a PhD lecture here at the University of Iceland. And it happens here in the Faculty of Earth Sciences, in the School of Engineering and Natural Sciences. And the defense for this PhD work has already taken place. The candidate is Dr. Paavo Nikkola, and this is a remote lecture given from Finland due to the present COVID-19 restrictions on travel. And Paavo Nikkola did his PhD as a joint degree involving both University of Iceland and the University of Helsinki. The defense was delivered in Helsinki on the 20th of March 2020. The title of the thesis is From Partial Melting to Lava Emplacement, the Petrogenesis of Some Icelandic Basalts. His advisor in this work has been Dr. Þorvaldur Þórðarson, professor in the Faculty of Earth Sciences, University of Iceland, and the PhD committee. There has been Dr. Tapani Romo, professor at the Department of Geosciences and Geography at the University of Helsinki, Dr. Eniko Bali, associate professor in the Faculty of Earth Sciences at the University of Iceland, and Dr. Guðmundur Guðfinnsson, research scholar at the Institute of Earth Sciences, University of Iceland. The opponent at the defense in Helsinki was Dr. Reidar Trønes, professor at the Natural History Museum, Center for Earth Evolution and Dynamics at the University of Oslo. The candidate, Paavo Oskari Nikkola, was born and raised in rural Finland. In 2015, Paavo started a PhD project aiming at a joint doctorate degree from the University of Iceland and the University of Helsinki. Paavo now currently he lives in Espoo, Finland. And although he is now indoors and very decent attire, he enjoys his family life and prefers to spend his free time outdoors as often as possible. This lecture takes place through Zoom and it is recorded. Following the lecture, there will be a session on questions and answers. I will give directions on how this will happen, the questioning session, once Paavo has completed his lecture. And without further ado, I will then give the floor to Paavo, and just bear with me while I do something about the technicalities. And Paavo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Magnus. So I hope everybody is hearing me well. Without further ado, I will start my presentation. So just a second. Here we are. So exactly as Magnus just explained, my doctoral thesis, my doctoral work, my research has been a cooperation between University of Helsinki and University of Iceland, and I have been co-supervised. So my supervisor in University of Iceland was Þorvaldur Þórðarson, and my supervisor in University of Helsinki was Tapani Romo. The title of my thesis here, From Partial Melting to Lava Emplacement, the Petrogenesis of Some Icelandic Basalts, it gives away the main message, main idea of my research, which is to better understand basalt petrogenesis in Iceland. This presentation is an extended version of my defense which was held 2 months ago. So for those people who already followed my defense, there might be some slides which are now a recap, but don't worry, there's a lot of new information as well. So my dissertation in completion is composed of 3 different published manuscripts. And all of these manuscripts have their own individual aims and goals. The first manuscript, Signature of Deep Mantle Melting in South Iceland Olivine, published in Contributions to Mineralogy and Petrology, was a paper where I analyzed olivine crystals from various locations in Iceland and solved their major, minor, and trace element composition, and used this information to infer details about the mantle melting process beneath Iceland. Then my second paper, Mid-Crustal Storage and Crystallization of Eyjafjallajökull Angaramites, South Iceland, was a paper where I solved the crustal storage conditions and timescales of 2 angaramatic lavas in Eyjafjallajökull. And then my third paper, Formation of Segregation Structures in Hafnarhraun Pahoe Lobe, Southwest Iceland, a window into crystal melt separation in basaltic magma, is a paper where I kind of dissect or study Pahoe lava lobe in order to better understand basalt fractionation and differentiation processes. It's kind of a more of an old school descriptive study compared to this other. And then very important slide, motivation. Why did I do work like this? Why anyone should analyze basaltic lava flows? Well, the reason is that erupted volcanic rocks can be used to infer how magmas form and evolve in mantle melting and lithospheric magma storage. So by analyzing the products of volcanism, we understand the behavior of the Earth. My paper 1 was kind of a quite straightforward example of this line of work. I analyzed olivine grains, which are tiny minerals, sub-millimeter minerals in lava flows. And from this chemical information, I was able to infer new details about how mantle melts below Iceland. And this work is important because it's essential for our understanding of Earth's upper mantle and lithosphere. In addition, to know how different magmas are stored in the Earth's crust, it's a useful information to just understand volcanoes and possibly identify mechanisms leading to hazardous volcanic eruptions. On this slide, I go briefly through the methods of my dissertation. As most geological studies, also mine, it started from the field, especially on my paper 3, where this picture is from my wife in the quarry where I studied the Pahoe lava lobe in Hafnarhraun lava flow field. There I did this kind of a very detailed outcrop scale detail mapping of the dissected lava flow lobe. Then in all of my studies, I took a lot of samples and then I had to analyze them in a lab. I used multiple different methods. For whole rock analysis, I used wavelength dispersive XRF. And for analysis of minerals, I used electron microprobe and laser ablation inductive coupled mass spectrometry. And then when you have the chemical data, you need to somehow study, evaluate it against something, or you must do an interpretation of it. And for this, numerical models of geological processes are very useful. So in my paper number 1, I used thermodynamic modeling of mantle melting and magma crystallization to evaluate what could cause the different trends and trajectories in my olivine data. I used common programs to do it, PMELT, GoMagMat, and Petrolog3. Then in my paper number 2, I used 2 tools, thermobarometry and diffusion chronometry. Thermobarometry is a way of using mineral compositions to calculate the possible crystallization pressure and temperature, the pressure and temperature on which these minerals crystallized. Diffusion chronometry, then again, is a tool of solving magmatic timescales from the mineral zoning patterns, so how the minerals are zoned. And we will talk about this more further on. Fast overview. So this is a map of Iceland. Everybody is very familiar with this, I believe, in the audience, at least almost all of you. The brown colors represent basaltic lava flows of different age, and the yellow blobs are silicic extrusives and extrusives. And then there's the glaciers of Iceland on this kind of a very pale blue color. And these blue dots here on the field are the sampling locations of my paper number 1. So I had 3 locations, Haleibunga, Mosfellsheiði, and Kistufell, which are locations like centered or very close to the center of the active rift. Then I have quite a different geotectonic setting for the sample of Berserkjahraun, which situates at Snæfellsnes volcanic zone, where it's an off-rift volcanic zone. And same thing for these my samples in South Iceland, Stórhöfði in Vestmannaeyjar, and Eyjafjallajökull, Hvammsmúli, and Brattarskjöld samples in Eyjafjallajökull volcano. Also, these samples here are samples from off-rift settings, so from an area where there's no active extension occurring. And my paper number 2, I did a further study of these 2 ankaramatic lava flows, Hvammsmúli and Brattarskjöld. And then my third paper about the Pahoja fractionation processes discussed this Pahoja lava flow in the quarry near the town of Thorlaksfjörður. Okay, then to discuss the individual papers separately. And before I start doing this, especially for paper 1, I think it's good to give a bit of theoretical background. So why to analyze olivine crystals from basaltic lava flows in order to figure out how mantle melts? Well, the trick is that most basaltic magmas, when they are erupted on the surface, they do not represent partial melts of the mantle anymore. Although basalts originally originate from partial melting of the mantle, the magmas get modified as they ascend through the crust. There's multiple ways this happens, but mainly it's through fractional crystallization. So the material cools down and part of it crystallizes out. Also, differently fractionated, so different pockets or patches of magma, which are fractional different amounts, can mix with each other, complicating this scenario even more. However, if we analyze the forsteritic, so magnesium-rich olivines that from the lava flows, we can get information of the near primary magma composition. And this is because these magnesium olivines are the first crystallizing minerals from most mantle melts. And therefore, they record this nature of the near primary mantle melt before it's modified in the crust by large amounts. And that's why we can kind of then use the olivine compositions as a mantle proxy. So olivine compositions tell us about the primary melts of the mantle. And when we know about the partial melts of the mantle, we can then I can calculate how the mantle might have been. What is this composition and what are the conditions in the mantle melting. So, and this is an important point, in the end, various major, minor, and trace element contents in olivine crystals that crystallize from near primary mantle melts, they are dependent on and a proxy for, first of all, the mantle mineralogy and composition. So they can proxy and tell you information about the mantle mineralogy. I'm giving this kind of an example of nickel content. So if we have a olivine poor mantle it retains Ni poorly during melting, and therefore the partial melts generated should have a high nickel content. And then high nickel olivine crystallizes from these partial melts. But this is not the only thing affecting partial melt compositions and olivine compositions, as the conditions of mantle melting and subsequent olivine crystallization also affect how the olivine compositions will be. In great mantle depths at high temperatures, for example, olivine sequesters Ni less than in shallower depths at lower temperatures. And therefore, deep and hot mantle melts, when a deep and hot mantle melts, the partial melts have relatively high Ni content, and these crystallize high Ni olivine in crustal pressures. So now you already see the problematic aspect of using olivine as a mantle indicator. For example, high nickel in olivine can be the result of two different things. It might be that the mineralogy in the mantle is different, olivine poor, or it might be that the melts are just sourced from a hotter source, from a deep in the mantle. So just to recap shortly, I took all these sample state sampling locations. I had nearly 500 olivine crystals. For all of those, I did electron microscope analysis of the elements described here, and using a modified version of the high probe current protocol by Batanova et al. So we bombarded the olivine with a quite high probe current of 500 nanoamps. Then on the selected olivine, which were the most interesting in our case, I brought them to the University of Helsinki to be analyzed with the laser ablation ICP-MS. And this method gave me more information about the trace element content of these crystals, and as I will soon show you, proved to be extremely valuable. And finally, I'm sure everybody has been waiting for plots. Here is the olivine data, a glimpse to it at least. So here on there are two pie plots, and on the x-axis, on both axes, I have the forsterite content in olivine. Forsterite content is the molar amount of magnesium over magnesium and iron in olivine. Olivine as a mineral is a solid solution between phyllite and forsterite. So more forsteritic, more magnesium and the olivines are, the more primitive they are. And then as the parental magma fractionates, the olivine composition goes to the less forsteritic side. So about 91 in Iceland, for example, is about maximum forsterite content you can have in olivine. So it resembles like a near primary melt. So here on the y-axis I have manganese, and here on the y-axis I have nickel. And now everybody, just look at these plots for a short while. What do you see? The South Iceland sampling locations. Eyjafjallajökull Lavas, Eyjafjallajökull 2010, Storhöfði. They have lower manganese content than all the other sampling locations in Iceland. At the same time, especially for the high forsteritic side, the South Iceland magmas were nickel-rich olivine. So olivine which is high in nickel compared to these locations from Snæfellsnes volcanic zone, Berserkjahraun here, or Havøyabunga, for example, or Kistuvell even. So this was the major finding of the new finding of my paper number 1. Compared to all other geotectonic locations in Iceland, in South Iceland, in Eyjafjallajökull and in Vestmannaeyjar, the olivine compositions are different. They are low in manganese and high in nickel. And now my problem was now that there's two options to generate this kind of a signature, to have high nickel and low manganese in olivine. The first option is that there's olivine-free or olivine-poor kind of pyroxenitic source rocks in the mantle below South Iceland, which generates the high nickel and low manganese, or that the melts, South Iceland melts are derived from deep parts of the lithosphere. Deep parts of the mantle, sorry, not lithosphere. So like the mantle melting occurs deeper than elsewhere in Iceland in higher temperature. Okay. To evaluate this, I started looking on many other elements, especially these trace elements I had analyzed with laser ablation, ICP-MS. And this olivine signature, the speciality of South Iceland olivine, was shown on nearly all elements. Oops, let's go back. So here is, for example, a similar plot as before, but with scandium. So in scandium content, the Hvammsmuli and Brattaskjöld, which are samples from the South Iceland, have lower scandium compared to Halöjabunga, which is this kind of a depleted rift-centered location in Reykjanes Peninsula. Kind of similar thing with titanium, the Snaefell, the Eyjafjallajökull lavas, the Hvammsmuli and Brattaskjöld were high in titanium compared to the Halöjabunga and then the other samples. To evaluate, like, first I was like thinking that, okay, how could I like indicate whether the mantle heterogeneity, so like these kind of olivine depleted parts of the mantle, are really necessary to explain these olivine compositions. I thought to do just kind of a numerical modeling of just the melting of a normal mantle. So like kind of a generic lertsolite, peridolite mantle. And to see if just partial melting at different depths and different rates of partial melting, like procentual amounts of partial melting, could only explain the olivine composition as we see, or would we need to have like heterogeneity in the mantle source? So I started doing, I did these models, and here is the model results. So these are numerical models of adiabatic near fractional mantle melting. Here is a 2% mantle melt at which would kind of separate from the mantle at 2.6 gigabars, and then 5%, 10%, 15%, 20%, 25% melt. So here the mantle is melted at 25%, and we are close to a half gigapascal pressure. So very close to the like almost like a lithospheric pressures. And I found out that this the compositional variation in olivine is almost completely just explainable by melting of a normal lertsolithic mantle by different degrees at different pressures. So, for example, here for titanium, the South Iceland magmas, the olivine's titanium content would infer that the parental melt of them was generated by just maybe 5% partial melting of the mantle. Whereas for Halöjabunga in Reykjanes Peninsula, the partial melting degree should have been 25%. There was one element for which there was some indication that some mantle heterogeneity might be required. It was zinc. Zinc content zinc has a partition coefficient for mantle and mantle melts of around 1. So the degree of partial melting and the depth where the melts separate from the mantle does not really affect the zinc content. But the South Iceland olivines also were a bit high in zinc. So there might be that the zinc inferred that, okay, the source is also somewhat enriched, but mostly just a melting of a normal electrolytic mantle was able to explain the olivine compositions. So, to discuss and reflect this a bit more, first of all, it is important to weigh different options which are potentially responsible for the South Iceland olivine signature, or any olivine signature in that case. And my analysis kind of revealed during this paper that, okay, at least like olivine-free mantle source, like source which is completely olivine-free, is not necessary to explain the signature I found from South Iceland, from AF Atliagut and Vestmannaeyjar. And it is likely that the signature owes to a deep, high temperature melting of a maybe somewhat enriched mantle, maybe a pyroxenite peridotite hybrid. So, although the olivine compositions themselves didn't strongly infer for like heterogeneity in the mantle, except maybe just the zinc content in the olivines, we have had other methods, like especially the Cambridge group has done a lot of research on the major and trace element compositions of lavas, which indicates that some mantle heterogeneity is needed in Iceland. So it's very likely that below South Iceland, these deep melting parts of the mantle are also somewhat enriched. And then we have a further question. When we now only find this olivine signature in South Iceland, is the melting mantle below South Iceland compositionally different compared to the rest of Iceland? So, for some reason, is it so that below South Iceland there is a more enriched mantle, which would then melt deeper because it's more fusible, more easy to melt it? Is there more of it below South Iceland? Or is it just so that the South Iceland magmas are tapping different parts of the mantle than what is typically being tapped in Iceland? And I don't have an exact answer for this, but I've always been, and in the paper also, I was leaning to the latter option. And this is because the South Iceland is so kind of a unique location in the geotectonic setting of Iceland. So there's a low melting degree in South Iceland because it's off-rift setting, and the volcanic activity there is juvenile. It is quite recent. Only maybe the last 3 million years there's been like volcanic activity. And these two things could favor effective tapping of the most enriched lithologies in the deep parts of the mantle. So the low melting degree makes it so that only the most fertile parts of the mantle are being tapped at deep parts, and at the shallower parts the mantle might not be melting at all. Then recently there's been also other hypotheses. Paper by Saimi and Maja Rasmussen. Recently they put out this hypothesis that maybe also they also identified the same signal that I identified in my paper on the South Iceland olivine, and they hypothesized that it might also mean that the plume below Iceland is bent kind of from the South Iceland, that there actually could be some more enriched material also below the South Iceland. But yeah. So to conclude the findings from my paper 1, in the context of pre-existing data, an anomalous compositional signature in olivine macrocrystals was identified from South Iceland volcanic rocks, and I relate this signature to the great depth of melting. Calculatively, something greater depth of melting than 45 kilometers, of somewhat enriched but likely olivine-bearing mantle below South Iceland. And I believe the signature may relate to the juvenility of volcanism at the area, which favors tapping of the most fertile components in relatively deep parts of the mantle. And then we have this additional intriguing hypothesis by Saimi and Maya, where the South Iceland olivine signature, and then maybe the lack of it in Snaefell's volcanic zone, could reflect the shape of the Iceland plume. So that was all about my paper one, which is in a way kind of my main paper, and was the main scientific challenge. That paper took me 3 years, and then making the rest 2 papers I was able to make in 1 year. But yeah, anyhow, the second paper also is very interesting. We decided to look more closely to 2 locations, the Hvammsmúli and Brattaskjöld, shown here on this map. So there are 2 ankaramitic lava flows, and these had a very prominent deep mantle source signature. So the olivine in them was high in nickel and low in manganese. So I wanted to look more closely how these magmas had come through the crust, where the olivines and clinopyroxene in them had crystallized, and to just like think a bit further about that could there be also crustal processes modifying the olivine compositions. So both of these outcrops are ankaramitic. They host abundant olivine and clinopyroxene macrocrusts, like up to about 30 volume %. So they are just packed with huge macrocrusts, and compositionally, the macrocrust populations in both locations are nearly identical. So I analyzed the core compositions of the macrocrusts on both locations, and I kind of got very identical results. There was some minor differences, but quite a little. However, although the core compositions, like the macrocrust is same, in Hvammsmúli, the zonation between the macrocrust is different compared to Brattaskjöld. So in Brattaskjöld, all the macrocrusts have very thin zones, chemical zones around them, where in Hvammsmúli we have this broad, thick, diffusive zonation around the crystals. And Hvammsmúli also has some rare plagioclase macrocrusts, which were not at all identified from Brattaskjöld. So in all of my samples, not a single plagioclase macrocrust. So I used thermobarometry. So this to estimate on the clinopyroxene on what kind of temperature and pressure it might have crystallized. The method's name is so that jadeite in clinopyroxene thermobarometry. So jadeite is a pressure dependent phase, and using the amount of jadeite in the clinopyroxene I estimate pressure, and then I use diopside Heidenbergite ratios in the clinopyroxene to estimate the temperature. And these are the results. Surprisingly, although these both locations host only like olivine and a lot of clinopyroxene, their crystallization pressure is fairly low, mid-crustal crystallization pressure. So all the pressure estimates were within the error about 3 kilobars, which is give or take like 10 kilometers in the crust. And also that the clinopyroxenes, I already kind of knew it because they are just so chemically variable, the clinopyroxene population, but they had crystallized on fairly a large range of temperatures. So it looks like all of these crystals and these ankaramides are crystallized on mid-crust at a large temperature interval. And when this happened, the magmas, the parental magmas had a moderate oxygen fugacity. And this is something I know by analyzing the spinels in olivine. So using a spinel oximetry. Okay. Then another interesting question obviously is like, okay, if all of these macrocrusts, the crystals in these lavas, crystallized at the mid-crust, how fast did they come up? How long did it take? And we have a tool to estimate, and it's called diffusion chronometry. In the other location, out of the Bomggramites, the Brattaskjöld, we had these olivine crystals. This is an olivine crystal here, and they had so-called reverse zonation surrounding the crystal. So there was here we have a distance on the x-axis and a forsterite content on the y-axis. So 0 is the edge of the crystal, starting from here and going to here. And near the rim of the crystals, I have this part where the forsterite content is higher in the olivine. And there's a way this kind of a zonation can occur and form. And most typical way how to form this is that there's like a more primitive magma, which is rushing to a magma chamber and crystallizing its own composition, like to the rims of the mineral. So this is what most likely has been happened in the case of these crystals. So we have had originally a olivine with this composition, forsterite 82.5, and then we have crystallized a very like a forsterite rich 85.5 forsterite olivine to the rim. And when this happens, this like a compositional step in the olivine, it's not sustainable. It cannot be sustained. And what happens, it starts to balance even out by diffusion. So we will start that originally this kind of a steep kink in the compositions starts to milden out. And from this slope, we can model the time this crystal spent in the magmatic environment in which this kind of diffusion can occur. And by this type of a modeling, I calculated that the different crystals, this kind of reverse Brattaskjöld crystals, had been in the magmatic environment after the formation of this kink from 9 to 37 days. And I calculated this assuming various variables, which I have gotten using the clinopyroxene thermobarometry and spinel oximetry. Okay. And then, important note, what do these timescales represent? So now we have a time scale of diffusive reaccumulation, but what does this really mean? And I view it as an estimate of the maximum time that elapsed from crystal mousse desacration to eruption. So by crystal mousse desacration, I mean the event when all of these macrocrusts in the mousse zone or wherever they are in a magma chamber are desacrated and brought up by a carrier magma, carrier liquid. But it's the maximum time, and there's two reasons for it. And first of all, these olivines are hosted by a lava, and lavas, they insulate themselves very well, and therefore it might have been a part of this diffusive reequilibration might have occurred on the surface on the lava flow, and therefore this time scale does not only limit it to the ascent of the magma, but more diffusion might have also occurred in the lava flow. This is the caveat of using lava flows for this kind of a diffusion chronometry study. And then the other reason that they are maximum times is that we are not sure if this kink, the formation of this higher forsterite content olivine, is the carrier magma which brought this thing up to the surface. So it might be that there was like a time delay between that this like a more primitive magma intruded the magma chamber where this crystal was, and when actually the whole crystal mousse was desacrated and uplifted to the surface. So in always this time scale might be considerably longer than what it actually took for the magma to ascend up from the mid-crustal storage. So key findings. These two AF-atelier ankaramides, they crystallized in mid-crust of a moderate oxygen fugacity and the large temperature interval. And what was interesting about this low pressure is that olivine and clinopyroxene crystallization occurred before plagioclase at only these depths. Very often, and in many studies for South Iceland, for example, if we had had this kind of a geochemical signal that in lavas, clinopyroxene, plentiful of clinopyroxene have crystallized before plagioclase, people have very easily kind of thought that this probably means that the magma crystallized very deep, because in deeper parts of the crust, the clinopyroxene stability is greater, and that's why clinopyroxene easily crystallized before plagioclase. But no, at least in these AF-atelier ankaramides, although the crystallization occurred only at mid-crust, the first crystallized out a lot of very magnesia clinopyroxene before plagioclase started to crystallize. That was everything from paper 2. Very proud of that paper. Also, it's very nice to publish it in Jökull. Thank you, Brynnis, for that. And let's go for the third paper, which is my kind of more descriptive study compared to these other ones, but which I had a lot of fun doing as well. So the idea behind why to study basaltic lava flows in order to understand basalt differentiation processes. Because studying these processes is very hard from solidified crustal intrusions that have complex emplacement histories. It's actually quite rare that big intrusions, or so let's say like this, many intrusions actually have multiple phases of genesis. Like they are formed on multiple pulses of magma, and there's like complicated story behind most crustal intrusions. However, the emplacement of Pahoja lavas is simple and well understood. We have excellent, we have been able to witness the emplacement of Pahoja, and we know how it occurs pretty much. So the paper 3 is an investigation of magma differentiation processes operating in a Pahoja lava loop in the Hafnarfjörður lava flow field. On A here is the picture of the outcrop. What a magnificent outcrop it is. It is the height of the lava flow lobe is about 8 meters here, or 8.5 here, and 7.5 here. And so it is the whole outcrop is basically this kind of a lava rise plateau, slightly above the surrounding, and it's nicely dissected along a quarry wall. And the whole lava is full of these so-called segregation features, which are separated residual melts of the lava. And there's two types of them. We have these kind of vesicle cylinders, which are this kind of a pipe-like structures within the lava core. So lava core is here within the lava. Then we have horizontal vesicle seeds in the higher parts of the lava flow. So those two main types of segregation features. And I took samples of these segregations, and it took a lot of them. Altogether, I think I took over 100 samples, which 30 were analyzed or something. I've forgotten the actual numbers now. You can check it out from the paper later. But I found out that on the vesicle cylinders, which are these pipe-like structures in the lower parts of the lava flow lobe, their composition actually didn't match just a separation of a residual melt or separated residual melt. But their formation had to also include accumulation of primitive crystals to these vesicle cylinders. So here I have kind of a model of the formation. So near the base of the lava, these segregations separated from olivine plagioclase mush near the base of the lava. And then there was a vapor phase present, and these separated residual melts became buoyant and started rising towards the roof to the lava core. And during this ascension through the mostly liquid lava core, these vesicle cylinders were contaminated by the more primitive phases in the lava flow. And we see this excellently in the mineral chemistry of these vesicle cylinders. So they are slightly more enriched in whole rock composition compared to the main lava, but they still have a lot of very primitive phases. So primitive olivine and primitive plagioclase, very anorthotic plagioclase and phosphatic olivine. Then I found out that on these horizontal vesicle sheets, so the segregated melts which appear as these vesicle sheets, there was actually two ways how they were generated. Some of them were just accumulations of this vesicle cylinder material to the like on the roof of the lava core, whereas others had formed independently of the vesicle cylinders, as were these residual melts, the interstitial melts of the Pahoja lobe had seeped into different pockets into the upper parts of the lava. So here is like a comic or like an explanation of the petrogenesis, or the idea we have for the differentiation of this Pahoja lava lobe. So we have flow emplacement, then inflation of the lava lobe. Then around about a month after the formation of the lava, we have a fully inflated lobe, and the first vesicle cylinders start to form, and also the horizontal vesicle sheets. And these sheets to form, the input of fresh lava below the Pahoja lobe, so below the crust, must have been zero or very meager at least. So not much input, otherwise they could not be formed. And the upper parts of the lava flow, we see that occasionally then the formation of these vesicle sheets stops, and they are not generated anymore. So my hypothesis for this was that occasionally this lava tube system, or below the lava flow lobe, the core was flushed. So there was more magma coming into the lava core, and then it was occasionally flushed. And then at some point, the input of the magma ceases to the lava flow. And then during this time, the vesicle cylinders are kind of preserved in the lava flow. So by the way, I forgot to mention here the beige color is the segregations which resemble the vesicle cylinders, and the darker brown are those more evolved other type of horizontal vesicle sheets, which are also separate residual melts, but a lot more evolved than the other ones. So I think these darker browns, then they don't probably have anything to do with the vesicle cylinders, but they form independently by just seepage of residual melts to these void spaces, different gas bubbles, megavesicles in the lava crust, etc., or in the upper parts of the lava flow. Okay, to conclude the paper 3, degassing of Pahoja lava promotes magmatic differentiation and also transfers of residual liquid from the bottom to the top of the crystals in Pahoja lava core. And what was like special of our study, many other people had studied these segregation features as well, is how clearly we now identified how that these vesicle cylinders had been contaminated by these primitive crystal phases. And also that we identified that there was 2 possible ways to generate the horizontal vesicle sheets. And then I do quite a lot of discussion on how this kind of similar processes, as we now identified from this lava lobe, could also drive magmatic differentiation and mass transfer in magma intrusions at shallow crustal levels. So things to happen as we now identified in Hafrsfjörður lava require that there's water present. So to have a volatile water phase, in Iceland especially where the magmas are water-borne, you need to be quite close to the crust. So quite low pressures, maybe 1-2 kilometers below the surface. But anyhow, similar processes there could drive magmatic differentiation. Maybe something like Katla, where they might have like shallow basaltic intrusions. That was all. So that was the 3 papers. Now it's time to kind of give the take-home message of my whole dissertation. So my paper 1, South Iceland magmas are derived from relatively deep, low-degree melting of Sandmatensis mantle. An olivine-free mantle source, although possible, is not necessitated to explain the composition of olivine crystals in South Iceland magmas. So the olivine crystals at least do not necessitate the presence of olivine from mantle sources or below South Iceland. Then I studied the macrocrystal cargo and studied AF ankramites. They crystallize in mid-crust in large temperature interval. And although the relatively low pressure, olivine and clinopyroxene crystallized first and plagioclase joined the fractionation mineral assemblies later. And volatile exsolution aids separation of residual liquids from particrystalline magmas, thus facilitating magmatic differentiation and partial convection. So, then acknowledgements. My gratitude goes to all my co-authors. I had a very good co-authors on all of these papers. I thank my family and friends and the funding agencies. And I don't know. I think that was it. Maybe it's time for questions.
Well, thank you, Paavo. Now we go to a slightly different format. We have time for questions. And thank you very much, Paavo. This was very illuminating, and I really enjoyed this. This is not my field, so I'm not very critical, but maybe there are some critical people in the audience.
I hope so. I would like to discuss these things.
Yeah, and so we have some time for questions, and I suggest that we all that we use the chat channel, the Zoom group chat, and everyone can write a question there, or alternatively, you can go to the participants. There are 32 participants at the meeting. This has been very well attended. And you can click there, and there you can raise your hand. So whichever way you want, but I would suggest that we use the Zoom chat, and you write down your question, and then Paavo answers.
So yeah, best to use the chat.
This takes a little bit of time, so we'll see. The Ankara, there's just one question from me then. The Ankaramites that you were studying, how old are they? What's their age?
They are interglacial. So for the other Ankaramite, we have a potassium argon age, which is about 400,000 years. So they, and then the other one we don't know exactly. So, but it's anyhow interglacial. So these represent these Ankaramites earlier phase of Eyjafjallajökull as we see today. So they are quite low in the sequence of the lavas in Eyjafjallajökull. So yeah, definitely Eyjafjallajökull was a different volcano than it's nowadays. Only these early lava flows in Eyjafjallajökull are this primitive and have these ankaramitic lava flows. So for some reason they are not generated anymore.
Mm-hmm. So if somebody else is, because then I'm going to use my privilege to ask you then a little bit further. But before we do that, then we have a question on the Zoom chat. Can you see it, Paavo? It is
Yeah, I can see.
For a great lecture, Paavo. So if we can't use olivine trace elements, or at least nickel and Mn to reliably look at different mantle lithologies, what would you recommend we use?
Well, this is a obviously very hard question. Obviously we can, from just, if you want to just study like heterogeneity in the mantle, then it's suitable to look into isotopic compositions, so isotopes. But the problem on that lies that isotopes themselves don't give like straightforward answers of how the lithology, what is the lithology actually is. So, for example, is the mantle lithology like just a pure pyroxenite below, or is it like kind of a lertsolite pyroxenite hybrid? Just a lertsolite with less olivine. So yeah, in my opinion, we don't have a very reliable tool to look into the actual lithology of below the isentic mantle. You can like study the lithology also by studying just the whole rock composition of magmas, but it's extremely complex, and you need to rely on a complex models of fractional crystallization and mantle melting. So yeah, great question, Eemu. I don't have an easy tool for you, unfortunately. If you have something in mind, please enlighten me.
Okay. Eemu has a follow-up, but before I guess we'll just have to drill down then, says Eemu.
Yeah, that's a like a good note. And actually, like one of the way which I would actually be really interested of doing in the future is just study ophiolite complexes. So locations in the earth where parts of the mantle have been surfaced. Obviously, there's its own problems lie there also, that ophiolite complexes are nowadays then heavily altered, metamorphosed. The original mineralogy is often lost, and then the studying them can be difficult. But I don't know.
Yeah, here is a comment from Guðmundur Guðfinnsson. Sometimes erupting magmas carry mantle xenoliths. No such luck in Iceland. Are there no mantle xenoliths in Iceland?
No, which is interesting and unfortunate. And not even proven xenocrysts. So like just the crystals, which are definitely from the mantle. At some point on my research, I was starting to doubt whether some of my olivine were actually directly from the mantle. But no, this was not the case. So no xenocrysts either. So that's a good point also. So studying the mantle, if we would have xenoliths, parts of the mantle coming up, they would obviously be a direct evidence of what's the material below there.
But there must be a story in no xenoliths compared to other places, and so there is plenty to study for other people. I have, since I have the chance, you said your study of the Ankramite showed that Eyjafjallajökull was a different volcano than it is today. Would you like to elaborate on that a bit? In what way is it different? Is it now a very old volcano, or has a very complicated magma plumbing system compared to these types? Very interesting to hear your views on this.
Yes, so there's some, earlier there was some hypothesis that the plumbing system was simpler. So that in the old days when the Ankramites erupted, then most of the material could be coming like quite directly from very deep down in the mantle, or like a deeper reservoir. But now my research actually showed that no, this was not the case. Like the Ankara they had a magma chamber in the mid crust, and the material came up from there. But yeah, we do not know, but probably at the early days of Eyjafjallajökull, it didn't have a silicic magma chamber, but it has today. So a shallow chamber, I think you agree, we have a lot of evidence for the existence of a silicic magma chamber in Eyjafjallajökull now, but this probably didn't exist at the time of Ankaramite formation. Might be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, well. More comments and questions from the audience? There is here a well done and congratulations from Þorvaldur.
Yeah.
And I think we can all second that. It was a very well presented talk. Anyone who wants to make a final comment or question? Well, if not, then we thank Paavo for his work and his presentation. We are proud of, we in the University of Iceland are proud of the work that Paavo has done, and happy with the collaboration with the University of Helsinki, and hope we'll see more of similar things in the future. And Paavo, thank you very much. And as we say these days, in the COVID situation, we'll meet again. So,
thank you very much, Magnus, and thank you everybody who attended. Excellent.
Yeah, we should be giving you flowers, and there should be some reception afterwards, but that will have to happen at a later date.
Yeah, no worry, we will see. There will be a date when I will come to Iceland.
Yeah, we look forward to see you again here, and so I thank everyone for being with us today, and this was the first remote PhD lecture in this faculty, and I think it worked very well, and we all enjoyed this. So thank you again, Paavo, and thank you all for attending. And that being said, the meeting is stopped. Bye-bye.
Bye.